What are the concerns for democracy? Either of you do. Duff, maybe?
Well, an ideal is that we extend our principle on election day of one person, one vote through in between elections. So that means if you're going to win support of a government to change something, it's because you have won the support of a majority of voters who are pushing what you're pushing, and the government responds to that push and does what you want. But each of the parties are elected by a certain segment of the voters. And so they, of course, regard those voters as the more important voters for them, right, because they want to win the next election. Mm-hmm. They also want to try and build, because the more they build, the more seats they should end up with. Sometimes that doesn't work out with our voting system, mm-hmm, but generally that's what they're trying to do. So they can't just be appealing to their core, because especially if they lost the last election, they have to try and expand it. And each of those voters comes with a set of concerns, some more dedicated and committed to these concerns than others. But where you cross the line, and what's still to be defined in our system, is when you are that one voter and you are helping out your party or candidate get elected. How much can you do before you cause a conflict of interest for that person, that if they become elected, they can't actually deal with the issue you're most concerned about, because you've helped them so much that they now have a conflict between returning the favor to you and upholding the public interest. And that's what these new ethics guidelines have a general statement about. And we don't have situations yet, actual cases that have been ruled on, that really draw specific lines on specific activities and what actually crosses the line. So you can't ever get to the situation of one person, one vote, simply because people help out on campaigns and people are loyal to certain parties, and those people will have more influence just because they'll know the person who they've helped, because they've helped them, they've built a relationship with them. They're more likely then to have their call taken by that person after the election. Right. They're more likely to be listened to because they voted for that person. And so you're never going to get to this pure, oh, I'm an elected official, I now treat all the voters in my riding the same, right, whether they voted for me or not. You're just not going to get any elected official to do that. Even if they were doing that, they would still have a bias personally themselves on certain issues. Well, but even if it wasn't based on voter support, it would be based on their own personal biases, and say, well, I disagree with this 10% of my voters in my riding, and so I'm not going to have a meeting with them. I'm going to have a meeting with the 10% that I do agree with.
Now, how does that tie into the activity of lobbyists?
Well, this is where these lines are just starting to be drawn in our system. There was a code for the Lobbyist Code of Conduct, and early in '97 first came into force, and then Brian Mulroney brought in his code, which set out conflict of interest rules against outlying preferential treatment and accepting gifts and getting in a relationship that causes some sort of sense of obligation on the part of a public office holder to return favors. And those rules came into force in January '86. But there's been very little actual cases, very few cases and very few rulings that actually say, no, this is doing too much. As a voter or a registered lobbyist, as an individual or an organization, you've crossed the line, you've done too much for this official, and now this official cannot make decisions on your issue area of concern because they're in a conflict of interest. They have a sense of obligation to return favors to you. And the rule worldwide on conflict of interest is, if you have that sense of obligation, you can't participate in the policy making or decision making or even discussions about it, because no one can know what's going on in your head, whether you are making your decisions to help your friend who helped you, or whether you're making them because you think it's actually in the public interest. And we'll have a few rulings, should come very soon, that will actually define this. We have the vague rules, the vague regulations, and guidelines, but we don't have the rulings yet that have actually drawn the lines. And then we'll have more cases come forward and more specific lines be drawn. And right now the industry is very, very worried because the guidelines are very generally worded, and they don't know where the lines are, so they don't know what crosses the line. And the sooner it's cleared up, the better for everybody. It's not, Democracy Watch has no interest in, oh, let's catch a bunch of people doing something wrong when the rules are vague. Because likely what they'll do, first of all, is they'll appeal to the courts, and the courts will say, as we had in a case last March, we're not going to rule on that specific situation because the rules were vague. We're just going to set out what is right and wrong in a more specific way than has been set out before. So that's where we're at, and that's been it's now 24 years, since 1986, that we have not had these lines drawn and defined, but now they finally are being forced to define them and draw the lines.